The story of the Mongol Empire does not begin with a conqueror's march or a clash of armies. It begins in the vast, endless expanse of the Eurasian steppe, a land of grass and sky, wind and silence, where survival was measured not in years, but in seasons. Before the rise of Genghis Khan, the world of the steppe seemed destined to remain fragmented and overlooked, a place of wandering clans and fleeting power, far removed from the glittering courts of China, Persia, or Europe. Yet it was from this harsh and unforgiving land that a force would emerge to reshape the destiny of continents. In the 12th century, Eurasia was a patchwork of empires, kingdoms, and city-states. To the east, China was divided between rival dynasties. The Yuan Dynasty controlled the north, ruling from their fortress cities with powerful armies of infantry and heavy cavalry. To the south, the Song dynasty thrived in culture, commerce, and science, but its military was weaker and often on the defensive. Between them lay constant tension and warfare, and neither dynasty paid much attention to the nomadic peoples beyond their northern borders. Further west, the Islamic world was fractured but still formidable. The Khwarezmian Empire, rising in Central Asia, controlled the rich cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, centers of trade and Islamic scholarship. Beyond them stretched the heartlands of Persia and the remnants of the once mighty Abbasid Caliphate, still respected as a spiritual center in Baghdad but weakened politically. Farther still, the Byzantine Empire struggled against both external enemies and internal decline, while in Western Europe, feudal lords and emerging kingdoms were shaping a continent still reeling from the legacy of the Crusades. Across this landscape of power, the Silk Road stretched like a thread of gold, binding east and west. Merchants traveled its dusty paths with caravans of silk, spices, and precious stones. Ideas and religions moved along these same roads: Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, all mingling in the bustling markets of Central Asia. Yet the steppe itself, the great sea of grass between civilizations, seemed to belong to no one empire. It was the land of nomads, feared by their neighbors but never unified long enough to be a true threat. Among these nomads were the Mongols, a scattered collection of tribes and clans living in the harsh valleys and open plains of what is now Mongolia. Their lives revolved around their herds of horses, sheep, and goats. They lived in felt tents, called jurs or yurts, moving with the seasons in search of pasture. For the Mongols, the horse was more than an animal, it was life itself. A Mongol child could ride almost as soon as he could walk, and warriors spent so much of their lives in the saddle that they seemed born to it. Their skill as mounted archers was legendary even before the rise of their empire. But for all their strength as warriors, the Mongols were divided. Tribes feuded endlessly over pastures, water, and honor. Alliances formed and broke within a season. One year, a clan might raid a neighbor, and the next, they might stand beside them against a common enemy. Leadership was temporary, earned by charisma, wealth, or force, but rarely lasting beyond a single generation. Rivalries ran deep, and betrayal was always close at hand. The Great Steppe was not one nation, it was 100 nations, locked in constant struggle for survival. It was a world where power seemed to belong only to those who ruled the cities and empires beyond the steppe. To the Chinese dynasties, the Mongols were little more than troublesome barbarians, raiding their borders, stealing horses, and vanishing back into the grasslands before armies could catch them. To the Muslim rulers of Central Asia, they were dangerous, but distant. Few imagined that from these wandering clans would come an empire that would one day rule over both East and West. Yet the steppe had always produced conquerors. Centuries before, the Huns had surged out of the grasslands to threaten Rome. The Turks had risen in Central Asia, carving empires and spreading their language and faith across half the world. The Mongols were heirs to this tradition of nomadic power, but until the late 12th century, no single leader had emerged to unite them all. The land was waiting for someone strong enough to rise above the rivalries of clan and blood, someone who could forge the scattered tribes into one. In this fragile balance of power, the stage was set for an extraordinary figure, Temüjin, the man who would become known to history as Genghis Khan. Born into hardship, abandoned by allies, hunted by rivals, Temujin's rise was not guaranteed. In fact, his early life seemed destined for obscurity or death. But from these beginnings, in a world that underestimated the steppe and its people, a storm was gathering, a storm that would sweep across the world, toppling cities, crushing empires, and leaving a legacy that endures to this day. For now, in the twilight years of the 12th century, the great empires of Eurasia slept in the belief that their borders were secure, that the steppe would remain as it always had, wild, divided, and dangerous, but never united. They could not yet see the figure who would rise from obscurity, the warrior who would forge a nation of horsemen into the most fearsome army the world had ever seen. The world before the Mongols was a world unaware that history's greatest conqueror was about to step onto the stage. In the year 1162, in the cold and rugged heart of the Mongolian steppe, a child was born into a world of uncertainty and violence. His name was Temüjin, son of Yesugei, a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan. At first, his birth carried little promise. He was but one child among countless others in the shifting sea of Mongol tribes. Yet destiny is often written in hardship, and Temujin's childhood was a crucible that would forge the steel of one of history's greatest conquerors. The Mongol steppe was a brutal place. Life depended on horses, herds, and the strength of the bow. Every family carried weapons, for raiding and retaliation were as common as breathing. When Temujin was still a boy, his father Yesugei was poisoned by enemies during a feast, leaving the family vulnerable and without protection. In an instant, the young boy's world collapsed. His tribe, unwilling to support a widow and her small children, cast them out. Temujin's family was left to wander the steppe alone, surviving on roots, wild berries, and whatever small game they could catch. These years of exile left a permanent scar on Temujin. Hunger and desperation became his constant companions. He learned early that loyalty was fragile, that betrayal came easily, and that only strength could command respect. Yet amid this suffering, he also learned resilience. He cared for his siblings, hunted to feed them, and endured the biting cold of Mongolian winters without complaint. Hardship was shaping him into something more than just another steppe warrior. It was molding him into a leader. As he grew into youth, Temujin began to gather companions, forging friendships that would become the backbone of his rise. Among them were men like Gelmi and Subutai, who would later become generals of legendary reputation. Even in his early years, Temujin possessed a gift for inspiring loyalty. He did not lead through wealth or noble birth, but through his unshakable will and ability to reward those who served him faithfully. He believed in merit over bloodline, a radical idea in a society bound by clan hierarchies. But the path was far from smooth. Temujin's early life was a cycle of victories and defeats, alliances and betrayals. He married Bert, the woman who would remain his wife and closest partner, but almost immediately she was kidnapped by a rival tribe. Temujin waged a desperate campaign to rescue her, showing both his determination and the fierce loyalty of those who followed him. In these struggles, his reputation began to grow. People whispered of his courage, his intelligence, and his ability to turn even dire situations into triumphs. The turning point came when Temujin sought recognition from the ruling power of the steppes, the Khanate tribe, led by the powerful chieftain Togrul, also known as Khan. Temujin appealed to Togrul as a father figure and ally, gaining his support against rivals. This alliance gave him legitimacy and strength, but it also sowed the seeds of future conflict. For in the steppe, alliances were fragile, and ambition often outweighed loyalty. Temujin's rise was not only built on alliances, but also on his vision for a new kind of order. The Mongol tribes had long been trapped in endless cycles of vengeance and feuding. Temujin sought to break this chaos. He believed that loyalty should not be to clan alone, but to the leader who proved himself strongest. He reorganized his growing band of followers into units not based on kinship, but on merit. 10 warriors formed a squad, 100 a company, 1,000 a regiment, each commanded by trusted men who had earned their place. This structure eroded the old tribal divisions and built a new sense of unity. Yet as his power grew, so did the number of enemies arrayed against him. Rival chieftains feared his influence, and old allies turned against him. Temüjin was ambushed, captured, and enslaved by a rival clan, forced to wear a wooden collar around his neck. For days he endured humiliation, his fate seemingly sealed. But his iron will would not be broken. He escaped with the help of a sympathetic guard, returning to his followers with a new lesson etched into his soul. Never again would he allow himself to be vulnerable. From then on, he ruled with both generosity and terror, ensuring that loyalty was rewarded richly and betrayal punished without mercy. By the year 1201, Temüjin was no longer merely a wandering warlord. He had grown into a formidable force, commanding thousands of warriors united under his banner. The decisive moment came in 1206, when he gathered his followers at the banks of the Anan River. There, in a great assembly known as a Kurultai, the Mongol tribes proclaimed him as Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. It was a title that carried not just authority but destiny. In that moment, the scattered tribes of Mongolia were transformed into a single nation, united for the first time in history. Genghis Khan had achieved what none before him could. He had broken the cycle of endless tribal conflict and forged a disciplined, loyal, and unstoppable war machine. His warriors swore loyalty not to tribe or family, but to him. His word was law, his vision their mission. The rise of Temüjin was more than the story of one man's ambition. It was the awakening of a storm. From the ashes of exile and betrayal, he had built an army unlike any the world had ever seen. Ruthless in discipline, brilliant in strategy, and bound by unbreakable loyalty, the Mongols were now poised to ride beyond the steppe. The boy who once starved in the wilderness, abandoned by his tribe, had become Genghis Khan, master of the steppe, and the world beyond Mongolia would soon tremble at his name. The time of small raids and tribal skirmishes was over. A new age of conquest was about to begin, and with it, the rise of the greatest empire the world had ever known. The Declaration of Independence had been signed, and the bells of liberty rang across the colonies. But celebration soon gave way to grim reality. Britain, enraged by the act of rebellion, was preparing a massive military response. The mightiest empire in the world would not allow its colonies to simply walk away. As summer turned to autumn in 1776, British ships darkened the horizon, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers. The American Revolution had declared its ideals, but now it had to survive. The storm broke in New York. In July 1776, General William Howe landed on Staten Island with over 30,000 British troops, including German mercenaries known as Hessians. Facing them was George Washington's Continental Army, a force of barely 20,000, many poorly trained and poorly supplied. Washington sought to defend New York, a vital port and symbol of American resolve. But in August, at the Battle of Long Island, the British struck with overwhelming force. Washington's lines crumbled, and only a daring nighttime retreat across the East River saved the Continental Army from destruction. In the months that followed, Washington was driven from New York entirely. The Redcoats occupied the city, and Washington's ragged soldiers retreated through New Jersey, cold, hungry, and disheartened. For many, it seemed the revolution was collapsing. The crisis deepened as enlistments expired. Men who had signed up for a year were eager to return home, unwilling to suffer further defeats. Washington knew that without a bold stroke, the cause would wither. That moment came on Christmas night, 1776. With snow falling and the icy Delaware River before them, Washington led 2,400 men in a daring crossing. They marched through the freezing dark, surprising a Hessian garrison at Trenton on the morning of December 26. The attack was swift and devastating. Nearly 1,000 Hessians were captured. A week later, Washington struck again at Princeton, defeating another British force. These victories, though small in scale, breathed new life into the Revolution. The image of Washington, resolute and unyielding, crossing the Delaware became a symbol of American courage. Still, the struggle remained desperate. Through 1777, the British sought to crush the rebellion by severing New England from the other colonies. General John Burgoyne marched south from Canada with a large army, aiming to meet Howe's forces advancing north from New York City. But Howe chose instead to capture Philadelphia, the revolutionary capital. In September, at the Battle of Brandywine, Washington's army was defeated, and Congress fled the city. Philadelphia fell to the Redcoats, leaving the Continental Army battered and morale shaken once more. Yet while Howe triumphed in Philadelphia, Burgoyne's campaign unraveled. His advance southward was slowed by dense forests, supply shortages, and relentless American resistance. Militia forces under leaders like Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold harassed his column, cutting off reinforcements and supplies. At Saratoga, in October 1777, the Americans struck decisively. Burgoyne's army was surrounded and forced to surrender nearly 6,000 men. The victory at Saratoga was a turning point of the Revolution. For the first time, the Americans had defeated a major British force in open battle. The news resounded across the Atlantic, convincing France that the American cause was not doomed but destined. As diplomats like Benjamin Franklin worked in Paris to secure alliances, Washington's soldiers faced a more immediate trial. In the winter of 1777-1778, the Continental Army encamped at Valley Forge outside Philadelphia. It was a season of unimaginable suffering. Nearly 12,000 men huddled in crude huts, lacking shoes, blankets, and food. Disease ravaged the camp. Men marched with bloody footprints in the snow. Desertion and despair threatened to tear the army apart, but Washington remained steadfast, his presence a source of inspiration. "We must all hang together," he reminded his officers, "or assuredly we shall all hang separately." Out of this crucible of hardship emerged new strength. At Valley Forge, the Prussian officer Baron Friedrich von Steuben arrived to train the Continental soldiers. With strict drills, discipline, and organization, he transformed the ragged army into a force capable of facing the British on equal terms. By the spring of 1778, though thinner and hardened by suffering, Washington's army was sharper, stronger, and more determined than ever. Meanwhile in Europe, Franklin's charm and wit had borne fruit. The French crown, persuaded by the victory at Saratoga and eager to humble Britain, formally entered the war in 1778. With France came supplies, money, troops, and, most crucially, the French Navy. What had begun as a colonial rebellion was now a global war. Britain faced not only the defiance of its American colonies, but the power of France, and soon Spain as well. Yet survival was still not assured. The revolution remained fragile, its resources scarce, and its soldiers unpaid. Loyalists, Americans who remained faithful to the crown, fought alongside British troops. Native American tribes seeking to defend their lands, often allied with Britain against the colonists pushing westward. Slavery, too, divided the revolution. Enslaved African Americans saw opportunity on both sides, with some joining the British in hopes of freedom, while others fought for the Patriots. The revolution's promise of liberty was not yet universal, and its contradictions loomed even as muskets fired and drums beat. By 1778, however, the tide was slowly shifting. Washington's army, once on the verge of collapse, now stood more capable than before. France's alliance promised new hope. The revolution had endured its darkest hours and survived. Still, the struggle for independence would rage on for years, through new campaigns, betrayals, and victories yet to come. The cause of America was not secure, but it was alive. And for the first time, perhaps, it seemed possible that liberty might triumph over empire. The revolution was no longer a fragile spark. It was a flame that refused to be extinguished. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, the world might have expected his empire to splinter as so many nomadic confederations had before. For centuries, the steppe had been ruled by leaders who rose to power, only for their realms to collapse upon their death. But Genghis Khan was different. He had not only conquered, he had built a system designed to outlast him. His empire was divided among his sons and grandsons, but its beating heart, the unity of the Mongol nation, remained. At the center stood his chosen successor, Chagatai Khan, the third son of Genghis, who was elected Great Khan in 1229. Chagatai inherited not only his father's empire but also his ambition. Where Genghis had laid the foundation, Chagatai sought to expand. He established a permanent capital at Karakoram, transforming the nomadic empire into something more structured. From Karakoram radiated orders, armies, and administrators who bound together lands that stretched thousands of miles. Under Chagatai, the Mongols began their most ambitious campaigns yet, into the heart of Europe and deeper into the Chinese lands still beyond their grasp. The first target was the western Xia and Yuan dynasties of China, remnants of the great empires Genghis had battled. Chagatai armies pushed relentlessly, and by 1234, the Yuan dynasty was annihilated, its once mighty cities reduced to ashes. But the Mongols were not content with victory in the east. Their gaze turned westward, where rich kingdoms and fertile plains beckoned. In 1236, Genghis Khan's grandson Badu Khan led the Mongol horde into Eastern Europe. With him rode brilliant generals like Subutai, masters of strategy and maneuver. The Mongols swept through the Rus principalities, crushing them one by one. At the Battle of the Sit River, the Mongols shattered the armies of Vladimir Suzdal, leaving smoking ruins in their wake. In 1240, they descended upon Kiev, the jewel of the Rus, and reduced it to rubble. Survivors described a city of tens of thousands reduced to ashes, its streets filled with corpses. From there, the Mongols advanced further into Europe. In 1241, they struck Poland and Hungary with terrifying speed. At the Battle of Legnica, they annihilated a coalition of Polish and German knights, their heavy armor useless against Mongol mobility and tactics. Days later, at the Battle of Mohyj, the Hungarian kingdom suffered a catastrophic defeat. The Mongols feigned retreat, luring the Hungarians into a trap before encircling and destroying them. Europe lay open before them. Panic spread across Christendom. Chroniclers wrote of a scourge from the east, a punishment sent by God to humble the nations of men. But then, just as suddenly as they had come, the Mongols withdrew. In late 1241, Chagatai Khan died in Mongolia. According to tradition, the princes of Genghis lineage had to return home to elect a new great Khan. Badu Khan abandoned the European campaign, and thus the cities of the West were spared from certain destruction. Yet the shadow of the Mongols lingered. Europe would never forget the terror of their onslaught. While Badu carried the Mongol banner into Europe, Chagatai also turned his armies south into the Islamic world. Persia and Mesopotamia were once again brought under Mongol control, their rulers forced to submit or perish. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad looked upon the Mongols with dread, though his final reckoning would come later. The Mongols also pushed deep into Armenia and Georgia, spreading their power across the Caucasus. But the greatest challenge still lay in the east, the conquest of the Song dynasty in southern China. The Song were wealthy, innovative, and protected by formidable fortifications. For decades, they had resisted northern invaders, and defeating them would require persistence. The Mongols began their long campaign, a struggle that would not end until the time of Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai. Beyond conquest, the empire was evolving. Chagatai and his successors built an administration to manage their vast territories. The Mongols were not city builders by tradition, but they were pragmatic rulers. They adopted the skills of the peoples they conquered. Muslim administrators, Chinese engineers, Persian scholars, all were brought into Mongol service. They established the Yam system, a vast network of relay stations that allowed messengers to travel hundreds of miles a day. Trade flourished under Mongol protection, as caravans crossed the Silk Road with unprecedented safety. For the first time in centuries, a merchant could travel from the Pacific to the Mediterranean under the banner of a single empire. Yet unity did not mean peace. After Urgeday's death, the empire faced struggles over succession. His widow Temüjin briefly ruled as regent, maneuvering to place her son Guyuk on the throne. When he died unexpectedly in 1248, another power struggle erupted. The princes of the empire argued fiercely, each faction vying for control. But eventually, the mantle of Great Khan fell to another of Genghis' grandsons, Mongol Khan, who reigned from 1251. Mongol renewed the empire's expansion with vigor. In the west, he sent his brother Hulagu Khan to conquer the Middle East. In 1258, Hulagu's armies besieged Baghdad, the heart of the Islamic world. For centuries, the city had been a beacon of knowledge, culture, and faith. But to the Mongols, it was a prize to be claimed. After a brief siege, Baghdad fell, and what followed was one of the greatest tragedies of medieval history. The city was looted, its libraries burned, and tens of thousands of its people slaughtered. The Abbasid Caliph was executed, ending a dynasty that had lasted for over 500 years. With Baghdad destroyed, the Mongols advanced into Syria, defeating armies of the Ayyubid dynasty. The path to Egypt lay open, and for a moment it seemed as though the Mongols might sweep across the entire Middle East. But in 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut, they were stopped by the Mamluks of Egypt, led by Sultan Qutuz and his general Baybars. It was the first major defeat the Mongols had suffered, and it marked a turning point. Though the empire remained vast, it was not invincible. Meanwhile, in the east, Mongol himself led campaigns against the Song dynasty. But in 1259, he died during the siege of a Chinese city. His death sparked yet another succession crisis, plunging the empire into turmoil. It was during this chaos that his brother Kublai Khan rose to prominence, seizing the title of Great Khan. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire had reached its height. From the shores of the Pacific Ocean to the plains of Hungary, from the frozen steppes of Siberia to the deserts of Mesopotamia, it was the largest contiguous land empire in history. Yet its unity was beginning to fracture. The heirs of Genghis Khan ruled different regions: the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan Dynasty under Kublai in China. The storm had conquered the world, but now it threatened to break apart under its own weight. The death of Mongol Khan in 1259 was a turning point for the Mongol Empire. It had stretched farther than any empire before it, yet the very scale of its conquests now strained its unity. As rival princes quarreled over succession, brothers turned against brothers. Out of this chaos rose one of the most remarkable figures in Mongol history: Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, a man destined to both elevate and fragment the empire. Kublai had been raised with the traditions of the steppe, but had also absorbed the culture of the Chinese world he sought to conquer. Unlike many of his kin, he admired the sophistication of Chinese administration, Confucian scholarship, and the vast resources of the land. To him, the conquest of the Song dynasty in southern China was not just a campaign, it was the culmination of Genghis Khan's vision. In 1260, while civil war brewed among his rivals, Kublai declared himself Great Khan. His claim was contested, but his military power secured his position. Over the next 2 decades, he pursued the final conquest of the Song. The war was brutal, fought across rivers, mountains, and fortresses, but the Mongols adapted, employing naval fleets and siege engineers to breach even the most stubborn defenses. In 1279, at the Battle of Yamen, the last remnants of the Song fleet were destroyed. The boy emperor drowned himself rather than be captured, and with his death, the Song dynasty came to an end. Kublai established the Yuan Dynasty, ruling as the first non-Chinese emperor to sit upon the dragon throne. He moved the imperial capital to Khanbalik, the city we now call Beijing, and transformed it into a glittering center of power. Under his rule, the Empire of the Steppes became an empire of cities. Roads, canals, and postal stations linked the vast territories. trade flourished, stretching across Asia to the Mediterranean, protected by the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. This was an age of connection. Caravans traveled safely across the Silk Road, carrying silk, spices, and precious gems. Knowledge flowed as well. Persian astronomers met Chinese scholars, while medical texts passed from the Islamic world into Europe. Even distant Venice felt the reach of the Mongols, for it was under Kublai Khan that Marco Polo journeyed east. The Venetian merchant marveled at the wealth and order of Kublai's realm, describing glittering palaces, vast markets, and a ruler whose power stretched beyond imagination. Yet beneath the splendor, cracks were forming. The Mongols had always thrived as conquerors, but ruling vast settled populations required more than force. Kublai attempted reforms, blending Chinese bureaucracy with Mongol military authority, but tensions ran deep. The Mongol elite resisted assimilation, while the Chinese resented foreign rulers. Heavy taxation and forced labor bred unrest. Kublai's military ventures also began to falter. Twice he launched invasions of Japan, sending vast fleets across the sea. Twice they failed. In 1274 and again in 1281, storms later called the kamikaze, or divine winds, destroyed the Mongol fleets, scattering them across the waves. It was a humiliating failure, and one that cost enormous resources. Similarly, campaigns into Vietnam, Burma, and Java drained the empire's strength without yielding lasting gains. Meanwhile, far from China, the empire was fracturing. The unity forged by Genghis Khan could not survive the ambitions of his heirs. The Mongol realm split into four great khanates. The Golden Horde in Russia, ruled by Badu Khan's descendants. The Ilkhanate in Persia, founded by Hulagu Khan. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. And the Yuan Dynasty in China, under Kublai Khan. Though all acknowledged the legacy of Genghis Khan, in reality they were independent powers, each pursuing its own destiny. Rivalries flared, alliances shifted, and the dream of a united Mongol world faded. The decline came swiftly after Kublai's death in 1294. His successors lacked his vision and authority. In China, the Yuan dynasty struggled to maintain control over a resentful population. Floods, famines, and corruption fueled rebellion. By the mid-14th century, uprisings spread across the land, culminating in the Red Turban Rebellion. In 1368, the Yuan were driven from China, replaced by the native Ming dynasty. The last Mongol rulers retreated to the steppe, their empire in ruins. Elsewhere the story was much the same. The Ilkhanate in Persia collapsed amid civil wars and invasions. The Golden Horde, once feared across Europe, splintered into smaller khanates, harried by rising Russian principalities like Moscow. The Chagatai Khanate disintegrated into feuding states. By the 15th century, the once mighty Mongol Empire existed only as a memory, its glory scattered like dust on the steppe winds. And yet, though the empire fell, its legacy endured. The Mongols had redrawn the map of the world. They had destroyed ancient kingdoms, but they had also connected civilizations as never before. Under the Pax Mongolica, trade, culture, and ideas flowed across Eurasia in a way not seen again until the modern age. The spread of technologies like gunpowder and the compass, the exchange of crops and knowledge, even the migrations of peoples, all bore the imprint of Mongol rule. Their ruthlessness was legendary, but so too was their tolerance. Unlike many conquerors, the Mongols allowed freedom of religion, respecting Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and others alike. They valued skill, no matter its origin, and wove together the talents of many cultures into their empire. They were destroyers, yes, but also transmitters of civilization. Perhaps the most enduring legacy was psychological. For centuries, the Mongols were remembered as the horsemen of the apocalypse, the scourge of God, the unstoppable storm. In Europe, their invasions left scars of terror. In the Islamic world, the sack of Baghdad marked the end of a golden age. In China, the Yuan dynasty remained a reminder of foreign rule. Yet in all these places, they also left behind traces of connection, new trade routes, cultural exchanges, and even dynasties descended from their blood. By the time the empire had faded, a new world was dawning. The rise of Russia, the resurgence of China, the flowering of the Ottoman Empire, all were shaped in part by the Mongols' passage. Though the empire of Genghis Khan was gone, the echoes of hoofbeats still resounded across history. The Mongol Empire had risen from the windswept steppes, forged by the genius of one man and carried forth by his heirs. It had swept across continents, breaking kingdoms, remaking trade and binding the world together in both terror and exchange. Its fall was inevitable, for no empire can last forever, but its mark upon the world was indelible. To this day, the story of the Mongols remains one of the most extraordinary chapters in human history. A tale of conquest, unity, and legacy, written in fire and blood across the face of the earth. From the lonely steppes of Mongolia rose a man who would change the fate of the world. Temüjin, known to history as Genghis Khan, forged a shattered people into a nation of warriors and unleashed them upon the earth with a fury unseen in human history. His vision was not merely conquest, but order, a unifying code of law, a discipline of loyalty, and a relentless belief that the steppe horsemen could master the settled world. In the thunder of hooves, kingdoms fell. The Jin of China, the Khwarezmian Empire, the cities of Central Asia, the Rus of the East, the caliphs of Baghdad, all bowed or burned before the Mongol storm. No fortress was safe, no army untouchable, no empire beyond their reach. From the Pacific to the gates of Europe, the Mongols carved the largest contiguous land empire in history. Yet their legacy was more than fire and destruction. Under the Pax Mongolica, the Silk Roads flourished. Ideas, inventions, and cultures crossed borders more freely than ever before. Gunpowder, the compass, paper money, new crops, new sciences, all carried across the arteries of the Mongol world. For the first time since Rome, vast stretches of the earth were bound together under one power. But empires built on conquest are fragile. With the death of Genghis, his heirs carried the banner higher, yet their unity fractured. Urgide, Mernk, Hulagu, Badu, Kublai, princes of the Great Line, each built kingdoms of their own, and each tore further at the fabric of their grandfather's dream. The empire split into rival khanates, and though Kublai raised the Yuan Dynasty in China, even his brilliance could not hold together the vastness of Mongol ambition. Defeat came not from one blow, but from many. The kamikaze winds that saved Japan, the crushing loss at Ain Jalut, the rebellions of peasants in China, the rise of Muscovy in Russia, the resurgence of Persia and the Islamic world, all chipped away at Mongol might. By the 14th century, the empire of Genghis Khan had dissolved, its once united banners now tattered and scattered across the steppe. And yet the Mongols never truly vanished. Their legacy lived on in the nations they had shaped, in the dynasties they founded, in the connections they forged. The fall of the Mongols gave rise to the Ming in China, to a resurgent Russia, to the Ottomans and Timurids who would carry forward new visions of empire. The world they had conquered was forever changed. Its borders were drawn, its trade expanded, its cultures forever intertwined. The Mongol Empire was at once a storm and a bridge, destroyers and unifiers, feared riders of death and patrons of global exchange. Their reign was brief in the sweep of history, but its echoes still thunder across the centuries. From the ruins of Baghdad to the walls of Beijing, from the plains of Hungary to the steppes of Mongolia, the memory of their empire endures, a testament to the power of ambition, unity, and the indomitable will of one man who dared to rule the world. This was the rise and fall of the Mongol Empire.